Yes, Maureen, I'm particularly delighted and excited to welcome Professor Emerita Marilyn Cochran-Smith today. I first heard her speak in San Diego 21 years ago when she was president of the enormous American Education Research Association, and I still remember her presentation. It was on a tale of two newly qualified teachers and how their contextual experiences changed the trajectory of their professional lives. Now, since then, Professor Cochran-Smith, her passion for teacher research, for practitioner inquiry, and for teacher education continues, and it influences fields of social justice, equality, research, policy, as well as education globally. Her influence has stretched to Ireland many times, and in 2004, our paths crossed again when she was the keynote speaker at the first Teaching Council of Ireland conference in Cork. Now, the NEARI founders were there at the same event because they were launching their commissioned research on practitioner-based research encompassing professional development. So this is the third time our paths have crossed. I'm very delighted to welcome her here, and I know that all of you will enjoy listening to Professor Marilyn Cochran-Smith. You're very welcome. Hand over to you now, Marilyn.
Thank you. I'm going to just see if I can share my screen here.
That's perfect. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. Good evening, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. And thank you, Katrina, for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank Maureen and Katrina and the other NEARI leaders who've invited me and asked me to be included in this important session on teachers as researchers. I really enjoyed Emer's presentation. There's so much I'd love to talk to you about it. But I'm not going to take up the time that way. But that was a wonderful presentation, and I look forward to Kira's presentation that's coming up after mine. My one regret really is that I am not there with you in person. As Katrina just mentioned, I've been in Ireland many times, and at one point in time, I was spending a fair number of days and weeks regularly. I did a lot of work at what was then St. Patrick's College, and eventually worked with the faculty and some students at all the colleges in Ireland that prepared primary teachers, as well as having the opportunity to meet with the Teaching Council, some of the curriculum organizations for professional development, and so on. So Ireland really has a special place in my heart, and I do wish I could be there. As you can see, what I'm going to talk about for a little while is teachers as researchers, ideas with staying power. In order to talk about that, I'm going to draw especially on my work over 40 years with Susan Lytle on the topic of teacher research. And in case you're wondering how I figured that out, I realized just the other day that Susan's and my first presentation about teacher research was at a small conference in 1985. So it has been 40 years of work. I'm going to draw especially on ideas from our two books, which are on either side of this slide, as well as some of the major articles that we wrote together over the years. Now, of course, we built and build on the work of many other people, just as all of us do. We stand on the shoulders, as we like to say. I don't have time to mention all the people whose work influenced us, but I just wanted to mention, especially at the beginning of our work, we drew on the work of Stenhouse and colleagues in the UK, Kincheloe and Cochran chemists in Australia, Freire in Brazil, and especially we were influenced by, and we influenced, I think it's fair to say, the North American teacher research movement, which was just emerging in the 1980s. And especially we drew on the work of Goswami and Stillman, Patricia Carini and the teachers at Prospect School, the Teachers Learning Cooperative in Philadelphia, a whole body of work that we called teacher writing, which wasn't called research at the time, but was certainly work that teachers had done about their own practice. And then also the University of Pennsylvania's Ethnography and Education Forum annual conference, which included Teacher Research Day, which Susan and I founded, included it for many, many years and continues to do so. So I want to very briefly mention 3 ideas related to teachers as researchers that I think have had and hopefully will have staying power. I'm going to try to say a little bit about each of these 3, the very idea of teachers and other practitioners as researchers, the notion of inquiry as stance, and the idea that there are differing ideas about the relationship of knowledge and practice that underlie all sorts of projects related to teacher learning and really have a big impact, even though they're not often made evident or identified clearly or elaborated. Now, this is a lot to talk about. I think all of these ideas are complex. They have rich histories, they have rich traditions, and it's going to be pretty much a whirlwind tour. But given who's in this audience and given what I understand to be the purpose of your organization and the kind of work that people do, I know you will be familiar with many of these ideas and will connect them to lots of other work that you know of. So first, the idea of teachers as researchers, teachers and other practitioners. When Susan and I started our work, we started with a basic definition of teacher research that drew on Stenhouse and colleagues and others as teacher research is systematic, self-critical inquiry by teachers about problems that emerge from practice and made public in a community. Now, part of the context for our development of this idea was the publication in 1986, and some of you in this room, I believe, are old enough to remember this, of the 3rd Handbook of Research on Teaching. This was one of those massive volumes, very fat, very heavy, and it said on the book jacket, "This is the definitive guide to everything we know about teachers, teaching, and the learning process." What we found, however, out of the 1,037 pages that were in that handbook, with 35 major research reviews, there was no chapter that had been authored by a teacher or co-authored by a teacher. And as far as Susan and I could determine, there was no chapter that drew on and cited the research of teachers about their own practice and about their own work in classrooms. We thought there was something wrong with that idea, that we could present everything that we know about teaching and learning without paying any attention to teachers. And that's part of what, of course, there was research about teachers, but not by teachers from their perspectives. So this is part of what prompted our initial foray into teachers as researchers. And I think it's part of what gives this idea its staying power. Because anybody who's been in teaching, I like to say, for more than 15 minutes, knows that there are things that teachers know that other people need to know about. Another part of the staying power of the idea of teachers as researchers is its unity with some other genres, forms, and purposes, including, as you can see on the bar under the blue arch here, including action research, participatory action research, research by other school-based leaders and workers, that's in the middle, so it's not just teacher research, it can be research by principals, by school administrators, and so on. Self-study, and then what was prevalent at one point in time, the scholarship of teaching and learning. And both of those two on the right side were often done at the higher education level. What we did was to look at all of these genres, and then we used the broad idea of practitioner inquiry as a kind of linguistic and conceptual umbrella. And we wanted to see what these genres had in common. And we found that they actually had a number of assumptions and features that they shared. And we made the argument that these features gave these genres unity, but not uniformity. And I want to just mention what these are. First, and this is not as obvious as it seems to a group like this. This is sort of like, duh, teachers and practitioners can be researchers. To others, it's not so self-evident. Second, and very closely related, is the assumption that teachers and other practitioners can be and are knowledge generators, not just knowledge receivers or consumers. From this perspective, practice is understood to be a very legitimate and very important context for inquiry. And issues of practice are understood to be sources of really important research questions that outside researchers may well not have access to. In addition, very important idea that these genres share is that communities and the opportunity for collaboration are critical supports of practitioner research, teacher inquiry. Another interesting idea is that when teachers and other practitioners work as researchers, there are blurred boundaries between research and practice, research and action. So it's not so easy to say, oh, right now that teacher is teaching. And now over here, she's researching. Emer, I think we could take your example very easily here and say that it would be difficult if we had a video of you in your classroom over a long period of time to say, when is she researching? When is she teaching? Rather, the idea is that the boundaries are blurred. Of course, with teacher research and with these other genres, different conceptions of validity and generalizability in research were necessary and emerged and were argued about. But there is systematicity of data collection and analysis assumed in all of these genres. Now, there are often very broad notions of data, what counts as data, and how can data be collected, but there is still the idea of systematicity. And finally, the idea of teacher research and other forms of practitioner inquiry makes practice public. It's a way of making practice public and thus open to critique. Of course, there are different ideas about what public and publicness mean. And Emer's working with our critical friends. Is that a part of making practice public? And I would say it probably is. We also found that these various genres shared several critiques in common. I'm not going to go into those. I don't think I have time. But what we found was that those critiques both unified these various genres and divided them from many other more traditional forms of research. Let me go to the second idea that I think has had and hopefully will have staying power. And that's the notion of inquiry as stance, which you might have noted is the title of our second book.